The stench of burnt flesh mixed with plastic residue hung low in the early spring air, clinging to the damp moss beneath a railway bridge on the Galloping Goose Trail in Langford, British Columbia. It was March 19, 2010, just past 7 p.m., when two hikers spotted a scorched sports bag emitting smoke. One of them approached, unzipped the edge hesitantly, and stepped back in horror. Inside was a human body, charred almost beyond recognition, folded unnaturally, knees to chest. The hands and feet were bound tightly with synthetic cord, now melted into the skin. A section of the jaw had been exposed by heat damage. A sock, partially burned, remained lodged in the victim's mouth. The posture of the body suggested an attempt to escape confinement. This was not a random act of violence. The care with which the body had been concealed and transported, sealed in a hockey duffel bag, carried onto public transport, and burned in a secluded outdoor area, implied premeditation. There was no sign of panic at the scene, no hasty attempts to obscure evidence. The act of burning the body, though incomplete, was deliberate and precise, enough to hinder identification, but not erase all forensic traces. The local RCMP initiated their investigation by prioritizing missing persons reports in the area. Within 72 hours, dental records confirmed the body belonged to Kimberly Proctor, an 18-year-old high school student who had last been seen the morning prior at the Langford bus exchange. She had not shown up for her babysitting job, nor returned home to work on her graduation dress. Kimberly had recently completed the credits required to graduate. By all accounts, she had been hopeful about her future. Her online activity showed a recent pattern of emotional vulnerability, exchanges with male peers about heartbreak, anxiety, and a desire to belong. She had been active across multiple platforms, especially private messaging apps and social media groups linked to her alternative high school. As the investigation widened, law enforcement obtained emergency access to her social media. Her last known interactions were digital. Investigators noted prolonged conversations with two classmates, Cruze Wellwood and Cameron Moffat. Both boys had a documented history of violent behavior and academic instability. Their names had come up before in school incident reports, though no legal action had been taken. In Kimberly's message history, several threads raised immediate red flags. One chat with Cruze showed him asking to meet the next morning, promising he needed to apologize for the way he'd treated her. Another, occurring simultaneously, was with Cameron, who sent her romantic compliments that intensified in tone the days before her disappearance. There was no indication that Kimberly viewed either boy as a threat. It was this dual conversation pattern, switching back and forth between two individuals from the same peer group, that allowed analysts to map a timeline. The digital trail was unusually rich. The boys had not deleted their messages. Instead, they had spoken freely, assuming privacy. In retrospect, the conversations reflected a disturbing mixture of manipulation, fixation, and deliberate grooming behavior. What emerged was not a chaotic or reactive crime. The victim had been chosen carefully. She was emotionally accessible, socially isolated, and already seeking connection in virtual spaces where protective oversight was minimal. This made her vulnerable not only to overt coercion, but to subtler forms of psychological pressure, feigned empathy, false intimacy, and appeals to forgiveness. One file recovered from Cruze's account revealed a chilling line. "You're beautiful, just the way you are. I can't lie to you." This message was sent less than 12 hours before Kimberly agreed to meet him. Another file showed Cameron suggesting that not many things are beautiful, but you are one of them. These statements functioned not as genuine emotional disclosures, but as tools for lowering her defenses. It remains uncertain whether Kimberly suspected anything in the hours before her death. What is clear, however, is that she had been interacting with her killers up until the final night, responding, asking questions, setting boundaries. She had not agreed to anything beyond a simple meeting. Her trust, though tentative, was real. The first tangible lead in the case, aside from forensic ID, came from the chat logs. The language used by both boys mirrored each other, at times even echoing exact phrases. Investigators noted that Cruz had messaged Kimberly about hanging out, while simultaneously messaging Cameron about getting her stoned first. The coordination suggested the presence of a shared plan, with an established timeline and assigned roles. At this stage, authorities had no physical evidence linking either suspect to the crime scene, but their online behavior, particularly their lack of concern or deletion, offered a behavioral fingerprint. The absence of fear, or even effort to conceal their interaction with the victim, pointed not to recklessness, but to confidence. This overconfidence would later prove critical in dismantling their defense. As digital forensics continued, a separate clue emerged. Cruz had not only messaged Kimberly, but had also posted in a group server related to an online role-playing game. That post, and what followed in the chat room, would become the turning point of the entire case. Why would someone confess in detail to a violent crime through a video game interface? What did Cruz believe about the boundaries between reality and virtual identity? And more importantly, what did this reveal about the psychological mechanism driving the crime itself? Cruz Wellwood and Cameron Moffat were not spontaneous offenders. Their psychological profiles revealed a pattern of escalating antisocial behavior, beginning years before the homicide. Both displayed early-onset aggression, with disciplinary records spanning multiple schools and documented incidents of violence against peers, animals, and family members. Their transfer to an alternative education program placed them in close proximity to each other and to other students with behavioral challenges. But their bond quickly developed into a dyadic dynamic centered on domination, control, and emotional detachment. Cruz was the more calculating of the two. He exhibited traits consistent with narcissistic manipulation and emotional callousness. Despite maintaining functional verbal and social skills, he lacked empathy and displayed a recurrent need to assert intellectual superiority. His ability to simulate remorse or concern in digital messages was part of a deliberate strategy, designed not to deceive authority figures, but to disarm potential victims. Kimberly Proctor, by all indications, was never perceived as an equal or a person by Cruz. Instead, she represented an object of opportunity, someone emotionally open, recently vulnerable, and socially isolated within their peer group. Cameron, by contrast, presented as more impulsive, physically dominant, and less socially adept. His disciplinary history suggested a long-term desensitization to violence, including incidents of cruelty toward animals and siblings. His involvement in the murder was not peripheral. He did not act under duress. He assumed the role of physical enforcer, but his digital communications confirm active participation in planning and psychological gratification in the outcome. In their private conversations, recovered from digital archives, both individuals discussed previous fantasies of control and harm. These exchanges did not emerge spontaneously in the days leading to the crime. They were ongoing for months, marked by increasingly detailed depictions of violence. The language was clinical, sometimes even playful, suggesting complete moral disengagement. At no point did either express uncertainty or ethical discomfort. The dynamic between them operated on a system of mutual reinforcement. Cruz initiated most of the conceptual violence, introducing scenarios involving torture and manipulation. Cameron contributed by adding physical detail and escalation. Their discussions were not framed as hypotheticals, but rather as shared goals awaiting execution. In one exchange, Cruz stated, "I'm going to rip her nose ring out and burn it. Burn her flesh." Cameron replied, "Why not keep her bound and alive?" These were not impulsive teenagers exploring dark thoughts. They were collaborators affirming a concrete plan. What is particularly significant is the absence of any external trigger. There was no inciting event in Kimberly's behavior, no real or perceived betrayal, no provocation. The targeting of Kimberly was opportunistic, but also symbolic. Her previous rejection of Cruz's romantic interest, though polite and non-confrontational, was used retroactively as a justification. In the communications that followed, Cruz spoke of teaching her a lesson, a phrase that appeared repeatedly. This language reveals a perceived entitlement to revenge, not rooted in justice or emotion, but in control. As the plan advanced, the coordination between the two became more structured. Cruz proposed a meeting under the guise of an apology, a gesture likely to be accepted by someone like Kimberly, empathetic, conflict-averse, and eager to restore social harmony. Meanwhile, Cameron prepared logistical elements, including the purchase of camping fuel and discussions around physical containment. The timing of their messages aligned precisely with Kimberly's last known responses, confirming that the attack was not only premeditated, but scheduled down to the hour. They agreed upon a signal phrase, "I think I'm going to make some KD," a coded cue used to initiate the physical assault once Kimberly was in their presence. This level of verbal cueing is not common in juvenile crimes of passion. It suggests a rehearsal mentality, where the offenders saw themselves as executing a scenario they had long envisioned. The first message that explicitly outlined the plan to restrain, seduce, and harm the victim was time-stamped less than 48 hours before the murder. This message marked a definitive point of no return. Prior to this, their conversations, while disturbing, remained in the realm of abstract fantasy. This message, composed and sent without hesitation, confirmed the shift from fantasy to action. No external stressor had forced the transition. It was a voluntary, collaborative decision based entirely on desire. When examining the structure of their relationship, it becomes clear that this was not a case of one dominant personality coercing the other. Both individuals shared responsibility equally. Their psychological reinforcement loop functioned independently of outside influence. They affirmed each other's justifications, celebrated each escalation in planning, and interpreted potential consequences not as deterrents, but as challenges to be overcome. The discovery of that first incriminating message reframed the entire case. It demonstrated that the violence was not impulsive, not emotional, but systematic and calculated. This level of intentionality reclassifies the crime as a deliberate psychological ritual, rather than a reactive act. It raises essential questions about how two young individuals, both still legally minors, could arrive at such a total rejection of empathy, accountability, and moral consequence. What internal mechanisms failed to inhibit their behavior? And to what extent did their digital environment, isolated from adult supervision, devoid of real-world feedback, amplify and validate their shared pathology? On the morning of March 18, 2010, Kimberly Proctor voluntarily met Cruz Wellwood at the Langford bus exchange. The interaction was unremarkable to outside observers. She had no visible signs of fear or hesitation. Cameron Moffat joined them shortly afterward. The three boarded a bus together, heading toward Cruz's residence. There was no struggle, no indication of resistance. Kimberly entered the home willingly. Once inside, the environment changed rapidly. Within minutes of arrival, the prearranged signal was given. Cruz stated aloud that he was going to make some KD, a code phrase the two had agreed upon in advance. At that point, Kimberly was overpowered, physically restrained and bound with materials already prepared. She was gagged with a sock, which was then secured with duct tape. Her hands and ankles were tied. The assault was not brief. It was prolonged, methodical, and structured in phases. Based on the post-mortem findings and digital reconstructions of the sequence, the victim was subjected to repeated episodes of physical violence and sexual assault. Both perpetrators participated. They alternated roles, one restraining, the other violating. There were no indications of impulsivity or loss of control. Each action followed what had already been discussed in advance, as if following a script. What stands out in this case is the level of cognitive detachment observed throughout the attack. At one point during the ordeal, while Kimberly was still alive and possibly conscious, Cruz logged into his personal computer. He sent her a message via chat, referencing her babysitting shift, in an apparent attempt to establish a false alibi. Other contacts noticed he was online and began messaging him. When one friend questioned his silence, Cruz typed, "Sorry, the freezer was jumping around." This statement, delivered casually, even humorously, provides key insight into his psychological state during the crime. The comment reduced a human being, actively suffering nearby, to a passive object, described in terms of malfunctioning equipment. The use of distancing language is consistent with perpetrators who externalize responsibility and objectify their victims as non-human. In this context, the freezer wasn't jumping, the victim was. The decision to place Kimberly in a freezer while still alive was not made under duress. It was part of the plan. The autopsy confirmed that the cause of death was asphyxiation from prolonged confinement. She had not died from her physical injuries, but rather from the deliberate removal of oxygen over time. The freezer had been cleared out earlier that morning. It had space and was operational. The process of suffocation in a sealed environment is not instantaneous. It involves a period of panic, followed by gradual hypoxia, loss of consciousness, and finally, respiratory arrest. During this time, the offenders returned to their online activities. Cruz continued messaging friends, navigating multiple conversations. Cameron reportedly left the house temporarily and later returned to assist in disposal. There were no indications that either party experienced distress, hesitation, or emotional dissonance. Their behavior after the crime remained coherent, consistent, and aligned with their previous planning. The disposal of the body followed the same pattern. The victim was placed in a large duffel bag, carried to public transport, and relocated to the Galloping Goose Trail. The fact that the offenders used a bus, a shared, monitored form of transit, speaks again to their overconfidence and emotional detachment. There was no effort to disguise themselves, no attempt to avoid surveillance. The bag was heavy but manageable. Cameron carried it. Cruz accompanied. They selected a location under a railway bridge, doused the bag with camping fuel, and ignited it. The use of fire served two purposes. It was intended to destroy forensic evidence, particularly signs of sexual assault and physical restraint. But symbolically, it also acted as a ritualized cleansing, an attempt to erase the body, to render the victim unrecognizable, to obscure the violence that had occurred. This is often observed in cases where the perpetrator seeks control not just over life and death, but over memory and legacy. Following the murder, both individuals returned to their routines. Cameron had brunch with family and went shopping for a video game. Cruz hosted a visitor later that day. Neither showed signs of fatigue, guilt, or psychological stress. In the days that followed, they engaged in memorial discussions at school, commented on online tributes to Kimberly, and interacted with peers who were grieving. In at least one instance, Cruz expressed contempt for the victim, stating he was glad she was dead. The final behavioral anomaly occurred when Cruz reached out to his online girlfriend, located in a different province, using the multiplayer game World of Warcraft. He requested a private chat, away from traditional messaging apps, believing it would be less traceable in that virtual environment, he confessed. He described what had happened, provided links to local news articles, and offered detailed descriptions. The recipient did not report the confession immediately. She expressed emotional support instead. This act of confession in a virtual space, detached from law enforcement, family, or reality, demonstrates how the offenders compartmentalized the crime. For Cruz, the digital world remained a primary stage for validation. His need to recount the act, not to boast, but to control its narrative, reveals an underlying cognitive distortion, that truth could be manipulated depending on the medium in which it was shared. Later, Cameron would do the same, confirming the events through similar channels. These confessions were not strategic errors. They were expressions of identity, part of a post-crime ritual that extended the control exerted during the act itself. The use of digital platforms in this case, both in planning and in aftermath, suggests a unique psychological reliance on mediated interaction. The offenders did not merely hide behind screens. They used them as tools to rehearse, execute, and relive their crime. The question that remains is whether this digital detachment contributed to the severity of their actions, or merely revealed a predisposition that had long been present. In the immediate aftermath of Kimberly Proctor's murder, both Cruze Wellwood and Cameron Moffat resumed their daily routines with marked emotional detachment. Their behavioral patterns showed no signs of disruption or stress, despite having just committed a prolonged and highly personal act of violence. They appeared at school, interacted with peers, and participated in conversations surrounding Kimberly's disappearance and subsequent death without hesitation or emotional restraint. Cruze was reported making dismissive remarks about the victim, including statements indicating satisfaction with her death. These comments were not slips under pressure, but deliberate declarations, offered in social settings where grief was prevalent. They reinforced a psychological stance consistent with narcissistic entitlement and moral disengagement. Cameron, similarly, made no effort to conceal his amusement during police interviews. He responded to probing questions with half smiles, elliptical phrasing, and apparent enjoyment in withholding information. His verbal responses implied that truth, to him, was a negotiable concept, something to be offered selectively for attention or control. These post-crime behaviors revealed critical elements of their personality structures. Neither offender demonstrated anxiety about being caught, nor did they engage in post-offense rationalization or attempts at concealment typical of impulsive or emotionally driven offenders. Instead, they exhibited a form of cognitive closure. The crime had been completed, and there was no emotional residue requiring resolution. This flat-effect post-homicide, combined with their continued digital activity and social engagement, suggested a complete compartmentalization of the event. The investigative team quickly identified online behavior as a key source of evidence. The offender's social media and chat logs were preserved and examined, revealing the full scope of premeditation and mutual planning. The use of gaming platforms, particularly World of Warcraft, provided both a channel for fantasy rehearsal and post-crime confession. In these environments, the offenders described their actions in detail to others, often including links to news reports about Kimberly's murder. These confessions were unsolicited and unprovoked. They were not attempts to relieve guilt, but to document what had occurred in their own terms. The turning point came when digital forensic analysts traced language similarities across multiple platforms. Phrases used during the crime planning, specific words, symbols, and metaphors reappeared in chat logs and gaming conversations. These lexical patterns formed a behavioral signature that tied both offenders to the timeline of events with a high degree of confidence. Subsequent surveillance operations, including audio monitoring of public meeting spots and wiretaps, captured additional incriminating exchanges. During transport to their first court appearance, a conversation recorded inside a sheriff's van revealed Cruze describing the police interrogation process with amusement. He noted how officers complimented his intelligence and how he manipulated their perception. Cameron laughed, adding that he just sat there with a big grin. This casual tone, even while under arrest for first-degree murder, confirmed the absence of internal moral conflict. Their court proceedings proceeded with both pleading guilty to murder and indignity to human remains. The prosecution sought adult sentences, despite their minor status at the time of the crime. Psychological evaluations supported this course of action, citing both individuals' high cognitive capacity, lack of remorse, and sustained pattern of violent ideation. They were each sentenced to life imprisonment, with eligibility for parole after 10 years, as mandated under Canadian juvenile justice limits. While this sentence was the maximum permitted by law, the impact on the victim's family and the broader community was severe. There was widespread public concern about the adequacy of the sentencing framework in addressing such extreme acts. Years later, Kruse submitted his first application for day parole, requesting escorted passes to attend church services. During the hearing, he cited spiritual rehabilitation and a desire for community reintegration. However, psychological reviews indicated no measurable change in his emotional processing, no expression of empathy for the victim, and no deviation from the behavioral profile observed at sentencing. The request was denied within minutes. Official records noted that his narrative remained self-focused, with no acknowledgement of the emotional or social consequences of his actions. The parole board's report concluded that Kruse continued to demonstrate instrumental behavior, using language and justifications tailored for perceived benefit, rather than emerging from genuine cognitive or emotional transformation. There was no indication of insight into the factors that led to the crime. Similarly, no evidence was presented to show he had undertaken any sustained rehabilitation initiatives that addressed empathy deficits or distorted power dynamics. What remains critical to understanding this case is not only the brutality of the act, but the persistence of a psychological framework that enabled it. Neither Kruse nor Cameron exhibited behavioral evolution over time. The ideological core of their crime, control, detachment, and denial of victimhood, remained intact. This raises important questions about the limitations of rehabilitation models when applied to individuals whose primary deficits lie not in impulse control, but in moral architecture. When empathy is absent, not due to trauma or immaturity, but due to a structured belief system that justifies domination, can it ever truly be reformed? The psychological profiles of Kruse Wellwood and Cameron Moffat represent a convergence of deviant cognition, entrenched antisocial traits, and mutual reinforcement within a closed dyadic system. Neither individual operated under duress, diminished capacity, or transient emotional disturbance. Their motivations were rooted in a desire for control, degradation, and domination. These were not impulsive offenders. They demonstrated goal-oriented behavior, advanced planning, and sustained cognitive engagement with the concept of harming another human being. The development of their criminal identities followed a gradual trajectory. Both had exhibited early behavioral disturbances, including cruelty to animals, social manipulation, and physical aggression. Traditional risk factors were present: parental criminal history, inconsistent discipline, exposure to violence. But what set these offenders apart was the degree of emotional detachment sustained across time. They did not respond to correction, empathy modeling, or peer influence in any conventional way. Their internal logic, once established, remained impervious to external regulation. The murder of Kimberly Proctor was not a deviation from their norm. It was the culmination of years of unchallenged, violent ideation, crystallized by their shared environment and reinforced through digital anonymity. The crime provided both a psychological release and a sense of accomplishment. They did not act out of hatred for Kimberly personally, but rather viewed her as an accessible vessel through which to manifest a broader fantasy of control and obliteration. Their post-crime behavior, marked by indifference, amusement, and self-congratulation, confirmed a complete absence of remorse. They did not seek redemption, concealment, or justification. Instead, they demonstrated a desire for acknowledgement, expressed through confessions to online peers and coded references during conversations. Their sense of identity became linked to the crime itself, suggesting a deep integration of the act into their personal narratives. The societal impact of this case extended far beyond the immediate trauma inflicted on the victim's family. It raised fundamental questions about the efficacy of current intervention systems. Both offenders had been known to educational authorities, had records of violent conduct, and had shown behavioral patterns consistent with escalating risk. Yet, there was no coordinated response, no long-term monitoring, and no proactive engagement from mental health services. The fragmentation of institutional oversight allowed early warning signs to remain unaddressed. The digital dimension of the case also revealed structural blind spots. The platforms used for planning and confession, primarily gaming environments and unsecured chat systems, operate with minimal real-time monitoring. They allow users to inhabit multiple identities, test boundaries, and share increasingly extreme content with little accountability. For individuals predisposed to manipulation and harm, these spaces provide a laboratory for behavioral rehearsal and validation. This case illustrates the limitations of conventional rehabilitation frameworks when applied to offenders with entrenched cognitive distortions. Programs focused on impulse control, empathy development, or anger management are unlikely to produce meaningful change when the core issue is not emotional volatility, but structural psychopathy. Neither offender demonstrated internal motivation to reform. Their behavior during incarceration remained consistent with earlier patterns, strategic, performative, and self-serving. In psychological terms, both subjects exhibit characteristics consistent with severe conduct disorder, evolving into antisocial personality structures. While formal diagnoses are reserved for clinical settings, their observable behavior aligns with key diagnostic markers: lack of remorse, deceitfulness, callousness, and a pervasive disregard for the rights of others. These traits were not episodic, but integrated into daily functioning. From a preventive perspective, the case underscores the critical importance of early behavioral threat assessment, interagency communication, and structured interventions for youth displaying persistent conduct issues. Systems must evolve to differentiate between developmental turbulence and emerging criminal pathology. Without this distinction, resources are misallocated, and individuals capable of significant harm remain undetected until it is too late. The murder of Kimberly Proctor is a stark reminder of what occurs when violence is not impulsive, but intentional, when the absence of empathy is not a symptom, but a choice. The challenge moving forward is not only to understand how such darkness develops, but how, if ever, it can be contained. Some psychological trajectories do not lead back to rehabilitation. In those cases, society must decide not only what justice looks like, but what safety requires.